videos, you get to request any custom request videos that you want me to do. Just thought I'd mention that if that's something you're interested in. The Snowtown murders are also known as the Bodies in Barrels murders, was a landmark case in the history of Australian justice. The crimes took place in and around Adelaide, South Australia. This case was one of the longest and most widely publicised in the history of the nation. These murders were grisly and shocking enough to attract the attention of every Australian. The citizens of Australia were appalled and wondered what kind of monsters would commit such offences. It wasn't long before arrests were made and the perpetrators discovered. The ringleader and investigator was a man named John Bunting. John Bunting grew up in an Indigenous suburb called Inala. Inala was built to house military, veterinarians and migrants from Europe and the UK. This was done so that they could live near manufacturing facilities and take advantages of the job opportunities that these facilities provided. Inala became a hotbed of crime and unemployment despite the measures that were put in place by the government. It was also isolated from services that were available to Brisbane citizens. In the early 1970s, Inala was regarded as a ghetto, as public housing units were stretched to the limit and impoverished families struggled to survive on social assistance. John Bunting was born on September the 4th, 1966. His mother was conservative, emotionally unavailable and domineering. His father was shorter than his mother, and she towered over him in every other aspect. She was his secretary, while he was a printing factory worker. They didn't really have any friends. They lived a regimented life with an immaculate home. John and his mother were constantly at odds because of his poor housekeeping. His room was always a mess, which irritated her. John was also irritated by a tendency to invade his private spaces, looking at belongings he preferred to keep to himself. He was fascinated by electronics and chemistry, but wasn't able to study these subjects formally as a result of his poor performance in mathematics. He was especially fixated on chemistry, so he pursued an avocation as a chemist on an amateur level at home. He developed photographs in a dark room and experimented with substances like nitric acid, brake fluid and chlorine. He would place a spider in the combined fluid, place a glass over it and watch the convulsions until the moments of its demise. He found this endlessly amusing, laughing at the spider's pain. Once the spider was dead, he would repeat the procedure with another spider. John was just as different from his father as he was from his mother. These dissimilarities manifested in other ways as John grew progressively more distant from him at the age of 8. A dark and traumatic moment happened during that year of his life, and this shaped him in the worst imaginable way. One day, while visiting a friend's older brother, brought them to his bedroom, strapped them both to the bed and sodomized them. John's friend was terrified of his brother, who had been raping him routinely for years. He was so afraid of him that he lacked the courage to retaliate. John was short and underdeveloped for his age, and was no less petrified than his friend. He began to cry, and his friend's older brother punched him. participant. Mercifully, his friend's father appears in the room, untied the boys and opened the door. He told John to collect all of his possessions and send him to a doctor. John was so shaken by the experience that he was unable to tell anybody. When he spoke about it years later, he referred to it as an accident. His explanation was that someone broke into his house and did it to him, that drove off on a motorcycle and were hit by a bus, negating any possibility of facing justice. When he got home after the rape, his mother saw the wells on his face and smacked him in the mouth for being late for tea time. From there, he went directly to the bathroom to stand the persistent and anal bleeding, as merciless as his friend's brother's assault. He was so ashamed to have been a victim of this act. He was anxious to prevent anyone from knowing he had been a victim of homosexual rape. At the age of 13, John met a man named Benny, who is in his 40s. Benny was no stranger to the horrors of abuse, though in his case he was abused by his father. Benny's father had cut off his toes with bowl cutters for amusement. John asked Benny for protection, and this was promised to him, but at a price. John was to act as bait for a trap which Benny was eager to put in place. Benny told John he would become his stool pigeon. John was to stand on street corner. He was short and slight of build for his age, playing the part of hustler. Men would walk up to him and ask if he wanted to go with them. He would say yes, but tell them he needed to inform his older brother first. John would lead the man around the corner down an alley where Benny would be waiting. He and Benny would beat the men up, satisfied by their surrender, leaving them begging for mercy and soaked in blood. When John was 17, he was hired to put up and bowl nets. The position required a lot of travel, and he did this trade throughout Maine, Australia and Tasmania, though he was based in Brisbane. He used this job as a cover story when he moved out of his family's home. His mother just assumed he was called away for long periods of time for work. As soon as he returned to Queensland, he would link up with Benny, who had become his best friend. He bragged to Jamie Flazicus that Benny had trained him on how to deal with chicken hawks. When John was 17, his daughter Tammy was born. He was separated from her mother by the time that she was born. He and his mother Lisa shared a casual custody agreement. He didn't tell his parents about Tammy. After all, the less he told his mother, the less she had to saw, and he liked it that way. His mother didn't want grandchildren, and it was John's preference to be secretive. When Lisa moved in with another boyfriend, he sexually and physically abused Tammy. Lisa asked John to pay for them to move to England away from her ex-boyfriend, a man poisonous cocktails. He hid his arsenal in a space above the ceiling. There he kept his poisons, ropes, knives, and blowtorches. John was very eager to fire his guns, especially after shooting a dog that rubbed him up the wrong way. He loved that it put the dog down so instantly. He loved the visage of blood streaming out of the wound. He hung the dog in a shed for a few days before he put it in a garbage bag and deposited it on a desert street on the outskirts of town. I struggle when it comes to reading about animals and children, He bragged about it to his friends, who shook their heads to his utmost dismay. John wanted to enjoy more out of the killing than blood. He wanted fear, terror, he wanted submission, he wanted bargaining, and most importantly, power. A few months later, in 1991, he met the woman he married, Veronica. He also kept his dark desires a secret from her. However, he would describe in graphic details about his time working in a crematorium in Queensland and how he was fascinated by corpses. He told her about a time when he stuck skewers into a pig and let it bleed before he decapitated it. She didn't believe his stories, so she asked him what he benefited from doing these gruesome acts, and he only grinned. John made friends with a neighbour named Robert Wagner. Robert had a troubled past. He was picked up from the street by Barry Vanessa Lane, a transvestite whom Robert had a relationship with. Barry was a convicted paedophile, and as a result of this, John did not like him. John and Robert became very good friends. At the time, John told him he had been abused by a friend's older brother. John decided to take things into his hands because of the anger he had bottled up. John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and Mark Hayden became a team. John also became close to Barry, even though he hated him. John was able to get information about other paedophiles and homosexuals from Barry. In August 1992, Clinton Trezise appeared. He was the first of John's victims. John and his team created a wall which he called a wall of rock spiders. This wall contained pictures of targets. The people whose pictures were on the wall were known homosexuals and paedophiles. Rock spider was an Australian term for paedophiles. In 1994, John began an affair with a woman named Elizabeth Harvey. It was through Elizabeth that he met her 14-year-old son, James Velasquez. James was also groomed and initiated into the team by John. Ray Davis was the next target. He was last seen in 1995. Ray had been in a relationship with a woman named Susan Allen. John knew Susan personally, and when Susan's 7-year-old grandson told her Ray had sexually abused him, Susan reported him to the police. However, Ray went missing shortly afterwards. John told James Velasquez what he had done to Ray Davis. He told James that he had tormented Ray to death. With time, these murders started becoming avenues for money making, as the team sold Ray's house and took his social security money. The next victim was Susan Allen. Susan wanted to be As a result of this, John decided he had to die. John and his team continued to withdraw from the social security of all their victims. They would get their PIN numbers and details before killing them. In August 1998, Troy Eude went missing. James Vlaskis told him that his half-brother Troy had sexually abused him when they were little. Troy was tortured to death by the entire team. He was tortured while the album Throwing Copper by Live was played. Apparently, John loved this specific album. Some of the victims' bodies or bones were found, but just like Barry's boyfriend, the cases were ruled as suicide. However, most of the victims had just vanished. John Bunting had barrels in his shed, and he kept digging more holes. Some of the victims were kept in the barrels while the others were buried. From time to time, John would open the barrels to check on the rotting corpses of his victims. However, he could not perceive the stench because of an illness he had when he was young, which had led him to losing his sense of smell. Fred Brooks was the next victim. He went missing on the 17th of December 1998. Fred was tortured with electrical devices, beaten, burned with cigarettes, strangled to unconsciousness, woken up, and then the cycle repeated. His toes were crushed, and all these happened with throwing copper on repeat. John and Robert were impressed by the amount of pain Fred was able to take before he finally died, so they put him in a barrel. Gary O. Dwyer was physically and mentally disabled after surviving a car crash. He was killed for financial reasons. James befriended Gary, and when the team decided to have a drink with him one night, Robert Wagner pounced on him, and the team began torturing him. He was tortured by an electric cable to his urethra. A few months later, Mark Hayden's wife, Elizabeth Hayden, disappeared. She was killed because her husband had told her about some of the murders. She was reported missing by a neighbour. The police found it surprising that her husband had not been the one to report her missing. John and Robert were questioned afterwards. The police began to connect the dots between the relationship that existed between John, Robert, Mark and James. As a result of these, John decided to move the barrels from his shed. He put the barrels in a Land Cruiser and parked it at a family friend's house, a family called the Freemans. When the Freemans and their neighbours began to complain about the smells coming from the barrels, John told them the barrels had kangaroos in them. He told them he wanted to start a company where kangaroos would be turned into pet food. With time, the Freemans told John he had to come carry his barrels because they wanted to move to a new house. They were moving to Snowtown. John and Robert also moved to Snowtown. When they got there, they leased a bank that hadn't been used since the 1990s. Afterwards, they moved the barrels into the vaults. At a point, John decided that the barrels had to go. He decided that they would take the bodies out of the barrels, cut them into small pieces, fill the barrels with cement, put the bodies back in, and dump the barrels in the sea. 24-year-old David Johnson was last seen alive in May 1999. He was James's stepbrother. He was neither a paedophile nor homosexual, but James wanted him dead, so the team lured him to an abandoned bank, and while they murdered him, they played some music. This time it was a tune called The Voice of Death. The tune of death was a recording they had made of previous victims. The sounds they had made when they were tortured to death. David was also cut up and barreled. Robert also found a receipt which showed the purchase of disposable gloves, trash bags and air fresheners. When they went